Hello and welcome to another video in the series Chess Guide to Win. This series is going to focus on a tactic, the fork. I will do videos on all the tactics in the future one by one, but this is going to be focusing on the fork. And in chess terminology, forking simply means attacking multiple opposing pieces with a single piece of your own. And it can be a strong move pretty much for that reason, because you're forcing them to respond to attacks on two pieces, and they're only going to be able to move one piece. Generally, you're only going to be able to move one piece at a time, except for castling. So when you fork the enemy pieces, a lot of times they're going to have to decide between losing one or the other, or something like that. And all the pieces actually can perform forks in the right circumstances. The king, the queen, the bishop, the knight, the rook, and the pawn. It just all depends on their attack patterns. And if you remember from the first video, or just the general knowledge of the moves, pawns can attack on diagonals one square away. So for instance, this pawn is able to attack this square and this square if there were pieces there. This pawn could attack this square and this square, and so on down the line for all the pawns. So when you're looking at pawn forks, you want to look, that's the pattern you're looking for. Pieces that are sort of, alternating on a rank or a row. For instance, a horizontal row like this one. This bishop and this knight would be prime targets for a pawn fork. So if it's black's move, he can move to from d7 to d5 with his pawn, and he would be attacking both the bishop and the knight. Now, whether this is a good move or not depends on a number of different things. One is this pawn being protected, because if you fork a bishop and a knight, the bishop attacks similarly to the pawn. It attacks on diagonals. Now it can move multiple squares along the diagonal. So, but the main thing is, if this pawn is unprotected, for example, if the board was like this, this would be a bad move for black, because white could simply take the pawn with no really negative consequences. But if either this pawn or this rook, for example, are protecting the pawn on this square at d5, then that's not really an option, because black can just capture back. Now again, it doesn't have to be two pieces protecting it. For this example, just a single piece protecting it is enough. Either of these, but it just so happens I have two pieces protecting it here in this example. So now you look at the board from white's perspective, and white wants to do a number of different things here. One of the things he wants to do is get his bishop and his knight away from this pawn attack. But the problem is white can only move one piece at a time. So one way you can sort of try to counter a fork is to counterattack yourself. And here there is a prime example of this, because black's knight at c6 is completely unprotected. So, and white is able to both move his bishop out of attack from the pawn and threaten this knight that's unprotected. So moving to b5 here with the bishop leaves black with a couple of different options, a few options to go forward. He can simply ignore the attack and take white's knight on e4, or he can move his bishop to protect the knight on c6, or he can move the knight to a safer square, whichever one of these he chooses to. And yeah, so those are all sort of reasonable responses to this attack, but they don't really offer material advantage. White's move has sort of kept the game even on material, because no matter which of those choices that he makes, white is going to have decent moves going forward. For instance, if he decides to take this knight, white can simply take black's knight, and then not only is he going to be sort of still even in terms of material, but this bishop is going to be on the diagonal attacking black's pawn on e4, which is now both doubled and it is unprotected. So going forward, he will need to try to deal with that, and he's not going to have a material advantage. Now, if black instead had chosen to protect his knight by moving the bishop here to b7, white will have sort of the tempo or the extra move to get his knight off of the off of e4 and save both his bishop and his knight this way. So, and that also applies if black chose to move his knight. That gives white a chance to move his knight and keep his pieces, keep the pieces sort of even there. So that's one really good way that you can sort of counterattack after a fork, and you need to be looking out for those, because just because you've been forked doesn't necessarily mean, even if you sort of made a mistake and allowed yourself to get forked in a pretty bad spot, it doesn't always mean that there's you're going to be down material after that. It depends on the board situation, and so again, one of the main things you should look for is pieces that are unprotected, or forks of your own, or just other counterattacking possibilities. And yeah, so that's if we had changed the board slightly, for instance, if we said that black's bishop was already on b7 before this pawn move, this pawn fork, this totally changes the situation, because now this counterattack on b5 is not a real threat, because black can just take this knight, and now white's option to take this knight is not a threat, because obviously the knight is protected by this bishop. So now white ends up down a bishop, and so from black's perspective, you should have potentially just moved before you decided to try that pawn fork. It probably would have been more advantageous for black to set up better before using his fork. For instance, moving this bishop here, or moving his knight, say here, for example. So, whoops. So, but now now this allows white to do any number of things. But if white doesn't move his bishop or his knight, or do some sort of other counterattack move, but there's not really that many counterattacks. So this, if for example he moves this rook here, he is going to set himself up for a pretty strong fork from the opponent, and he doesn't have really any good moves in response here. So when you're looking at forks, you really want to set the board, or set your pieces in positions that don't offer up good counterattack possibilities. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up another example. This will be a fork with the knight, and as I said, you can do forks with all the pieces actually. And this knight, if you remember, can move on an L shape. So it can move to all those squares, and one of the squares that it can move to is this square at c7, protected by the bishop. Now this is going to put the king and rook of black under attack at the same time. And you will notice another thing about this position is that the bishop is protecting that square. So black simply capturing the knight isn't a really good option, since the queen is the only thing that can recapture here, and or capture, and the queen is generally way more valuable than a knight. So if black takes, white's just going to take and be up a queen for a knight. So the other option that black has is moving his king to either of these two squares, because you have to get out of check if you are in check, whether it be by moving or capturing the piece that is giving check. So, and neither of these moves are particularly good for black, because it denies him the ability to castle for the rest of the game, and it also is going to block up either of these bishops and this queen to some degree. And this makes black's king very vulnerable. And again, also moving the king is going to sort of, it's not really helping him develop his pieces very much. So, in fact, it's actually sort of hindering his piece development. So now this is a very sort of precarious position for black's king, because it opens him up to other counterattacks. You know, white can give check with his bishop, he can give check with his queen, he can, you know, do all sorts of, you know, moves to continue the attack. Or white also has the ability just to go ahead and capture black's rook with his knight. Now, you know, that's sort of one of the obvious moves that white can do. The rook is generally thought of to be worth more points on sort of a point scale than the knight, and they call it winning the exchange. If you trade either a knight or a bishop for a rook, because you know the bishop and the knight are, as I said, generally thought of to be worth fewer sort of points, but white also can just leave his knight there. He doesn't really have any urgency to go ahead and take that rook, because the rook is, you know, it's not doing very much from its original square in terms of like helping defend this king or counterattacking or anything like that. Being blocked by the pawn and the knight makes it sort of you know, a little bit useless at this point in the game. So and you should always be sort of aiming for checkmate as opposed to just going for material trades. Though a lot of times material trades are going to help you get checkmate easier and quicker. So you should obviously be aware of that. But you also shouldn't just stop your analysis there. You know, especially if your opponent's king is sort of in a very vulnerable spot, like in this position. You should really consider multiple other options before you decide on what you're going to do. So again, that's sort of that example. Again, checks that attack the opponent's king and another piece are generally going to be very, very strong moves, because, like I said, it restricts what the opponent can do in response. He cannot really counterattack exactly. He's got to get out of check before he does anything else. So, for example, if you were to fork, say, a king and a queen, that is going to be one of the strongest moves a lot of times in the game, because they're going to have to move, you know, like I said, they're going to have to respond to the check, and if they can't recapture that knight, then you're going to have the option of capturing the queen there. So, and that's going to leave, you know, that side with the black with a huge disadvantage in material. So again, that's one of the stronger forks possibilities. And I'm going to go ahead and go through another example of a knight fork. The fork on the king and the queen. Now this is going to be a more late game situation. If you're looking at sort of the point scale for this position, you know, I'm going to be simplistic and just go with the queen as 9 points, the rook as 5 points, and the knight as 3 points. You can get, you know, sort of really specific about the point totals, and you know, try to make it even more sort of fine-tuned. But just for the sake of this example, we're going to say that the white has sort of 8 points worth of material and black has 9 points worth of material. So black is slightly ahead on that sort of analysis, but as you can see, white's attacking black's king and his queen with his knight, and black does not have a counter move to really do anything to both get out of check and save his queen. So this game is going to go from a slight, maybe arguably a slight advantage for white, to a nearly unwinnable game. I mean, it's unwinnable, but I guess black, if white made enough mistakes, black could get a stalemate, or he could he could get a stalemate. So black really would need some sort of terrible blunders from white to get out of this game with without a loss at this point. So again, you always have to be careful of where you're placing your pieces in any situation, but especially in a late game where you're against a rook and a knight, and you put your king and your queen on like sort of squares that could be vulnerable to a knight fork like this. So it's pretty easy to, generally it's pretty easy to avoid this if you're really looking, because the knight's attack range is sort of limited, to the L-shaped patterns, and it's sort of a short range attacker, so to speak. But it is very possible to get set up for a devastating fork like that. So I'm going to go ahead and give you another example of what the knight fork could look like, and this is another example where white's knight is forking black's king and queen. It looks slightly different than the other example, but it works all the same. Black cannot capture the knight, and black is going to be forced to move his king somewhere. It doesn't really matter where. Now this is a situation where white was further behind on material, whereas the pawn can turn into can be promoted to a queen if it gets all the way down the board. Before then, white is really looking at 4 points. I will say that the pawns are worth 1 point generally. So white has 4 points, and black has 9 points with the queen. So a much greater material advantage here. But again, it doesn't matter because white is able to fork black's king and queen. And we'll say that black moves here, and white takes the queen. So now we've got a situation where white has a knight and a pawn, and while it's going to be difficult to get checkmate with these two pieces, once you manage to promote your pawn all the way, or move your pawn down the board and promote to a queen, that's going to be a totally different situation. And again, you're going to have to make sure you don't get stalemate. You're going to have to make sure that you don't lose either the knight or the pawn generally. But it's not really all that difficult to try to get your pieces down the board here and protect. Really, all you have to do is protect the queening square with either the king or the knight. And once you're able to do that, for example, getting down here like this, this isn't going to be stalemate. Because black can move his king here, and then white has the option of moving his knight here and then over here, or he could simply go ahead and queen this pawn and lose the knight. Now that's not really ideal. Ideal would be to move his knight here, then black maybe tries to go here, then he can check, and now black is going to have to vacate that square, and now white can queen his pawn like so, and I go forward with both a knight and a queen, which should be very easy to go ahead and win the game from that point for white. I'll go ahead and go through some of the checkmating. I'm going to go through the checkmating tips and patterns and stuff in a future video. But just looking at the board, this should be a pretty easy game for white to go ahead and finish out. And black has no way to win this game. The only sort of best case scenario is if he gets a stalemate somehow, which would be pretty difficult. Could be pretty difficult. But you definitely need to watch out from white's perspective, getting the opponent into a stalemate. Especially with such a big advantage, it would be terrible to end up tying that game as opposed to winning it. So, and now we're going to go through one more example of the knight fork, and that's going to be, a knight fork can look like this with the king and the queen lined up here. And this is another example where white was way behind in material, but Black put himself in a position where he was going to be the one down in material. Once again, Black has to move his king. White's going to take the queen, and now it's just another example of White having to move his pawn down and promote to a queen or a rook. Most likely a queen is what you're going to want to go for, and we will have another example here. Now this is going to be the last knight fork that I go through. Now this example, it looks like the first knight fork I showed you a little bit, but in this example, White cannot win the game with just a knight and a king. There's no way to force a checkmate against a lone king or a king and a queen, I don't think. With just a knight. And now this is an example where White is really far behind in material. Just a single knight versus a queen. But again, Black has set himself up for a pretty devastating fork. The king's under attack. The queen is also under attack. So Black's going to have to move his king somewhere. And he's going to lose the queen. And this is going to be a stalemate situation because against a lone king, there is no way for White to enforce a checkmate with only a knight and a king. So this game isn't going to result in a win for the player that got the devastating fork, but it is going to go from a likely lost game to a game that is a stalemate. So it's going to be a draw. So White went from a likely loss to a draw. So forks aren't always, and again, material isn't always going to be enough to make the difference in a game. But even if the game is, you're really far behind in material, it just takes one sort of mistake or one really good move for you to get back into the game. And again, potentially draw it with a single fork, or potentially win it with a single fork. So yeah, you always want to be on the lookout for those things. And so yeah, I'm going to go ahead and go through another example of a fork. This will be a bishop fork, and we will say, let's say that the board is set up like, that's not right. Let's say the board is set up like this. Oh, add one more piece for the. Okay, so here in this position, both White and Black have a queen and a bishop. Now, Black's queen is on the black squares, and Black's bishop is on the black squares, and White's bishop is on the white squares. But otherwise, the position is, in terms of material, pretty much even. And we'll say that as White's move from this position. Now, if you're looking at this position from White's perspective and thinking about where to move, one thing that should immediately get your attention is the fact that both Black's king and queen are lined up on a diagonal, the white diagonal, and that your bishop is on the white squares. Now, going forward from that, one really strong move in a fork would be available at e4 from this position, moving the bishop to e4. Now, if the position is like this fork is gonna be a terrible move because Black can just capture the bishop. But if your queen is here protecting that square, this is going to be probably a game deciding fork, because Black's only option from this position, or his two options, are to move the king or to capture the bishop with the queen, which is likely what he will do, since if he moves the king, he's going to lose his queen for no compensation. So he's going to have to go ahead and capture that bishop and now he is going to be down a queen for a bishop, and this should be White's game to win. And so you had a position that was pretty much even, but again, one side had his pieces lined up, on the diagonal, and from Black's perspective, that is a very big mistake. To avoid forks from this bishop, all Black has to do is keep his pieces on, keep his king off of the white squares, and he should be safe from those kinds of forks from the bishop, because White's bishop is on the white squares. It's never going to be able to get to the black squares, just based on how the piece moves. So that's one thing you need to be aware of and understand when you're looking at a position and thinking about where you want to go with your pieces. One very simple trick to avoid those forks or avoid attacks from bishops on a single color is just to stay off those squares, stay on the dark squares. So, and the same applies for White. White wants to keep his king off of the squares that Black's bishop can attack, which is going to mean staying on the light squares. Again, like I said, from White's or from either player's perspective, if you notice that the pieces are the king and the queen are lined up on a diagonal, for example, if this were the situation, Black could have a fork like so, and it would be a similar fork between the king and the queen. So the king could have to be somewhere else, but in this position, the bishop would be forking the queen and the king and protected. So again, we've got another situation where it's going to be a queen traded for a bishop. So and now if we look at sort of we'll go ahead and go for a rook fork here. Add the rook here on the board, and now we've got a little bit of a close, it's somewhat close, but it still should be Black's advantage here. But similar to the last example where the king and the queen were on a diagonal, now the king and the queen are on a row, or a rank, as it is sometimes called. And since White has a rook, those are sort of the situations you want to look to avoid as Black, and look for as White when the pieces are lined up on those horizontal rows. So yeah, this would be a rook fork. Moving to f7. Notice that the bishop again is protecting the rook, because if it wasn't, the queen could just recapture or capture. So this is an example of a pretty devastating move. The problem is, though, it's not going to result in a win for White. So it might not be that great of a move if you think you can win with White, but again, with the queen, you probably, as White, you probably want to go ahead and take this draw, I would say. It's probably the best you can really reasonably hope for. Well, I'll say that, yeah, capture. So now, you've got a bishop and a king against a lone king, and you cannot get checkmate in this scenario. No matter how much you try as White, there's no way you can checkmate the opposing king. So it's going to go from sort of a losing position to a draw, forced draw here. But again, that was an example of a rook fork on the king and the queen. It doesn't have to be a queen. It can be really any piece. Again, this actually would be a much stronger fork if it was a knight instead, because this isn't going to give Black the option to capture the rook. So that means he gets a piece for free which means he's going to be looking at what should be a very easy in-game to win with a rook and a bishop against a lone king. So, but again, depending on what piece you're forking, what pieces you're forking, is going to sort of determine what you need to have in place before you do that. Since this is a queen, you know, you have to protect the piece that's forking. Whereas if it was, say, a knight, it wouldn't really matter if this rook was protected, because nothing can recapture the rook from this position, and the knight isn't going to be able to move because black has to get out of check. So, so again, that's one thing you need to be sort of aware of as well. You don't always have to protect the forking piece, but sometimes you do. If you're forking a piece that can recapture, or on a square that can be captured. So, and I'll go ahead and try to set up a situation where you can get a fork with a king. Okay, so if you get to the position for, let's say, black, it's black's turn to move, and he moves here with his knight, thinking that white is just going to take with his bishop. You know, thinking that white's just going to capture with his bishop and put black in check, and really just trade the bishop off for this knight. He might not really be paying attention that white has a different move that might be even better for him to do. And that move is going to be moving the king here to e3. Now this gets white out of check, but it also forks black's rook and his knight. And you will notice that from this position, black is not going to be able to move his knight out of the way, because it is pinned. This is sort of using one of the other tactics, pinning. This knight is pinned to the king, and I'll have a video going through examples of pins and explaining that. But black cannot move into check, so this knight is going to be forced to stay where it is. So black's going to have to respond some other way. And now white is threatening to capture either the rook or the knight. And it's sort of a dicey situation for black, because no matter what black does, he's going to lose that knight. He's going to lose that knight. Now, you know, he could trade the knight for the bishop, but then he's also going to lose his rook. So he's really just going to lose that knight pretty much for nothing in this situation. So that was the situation where black didn't really fully consider the options. He might have just assumed, well, white might trade his bishop, but that's not really a good assumption, because if white trades off his bishop in this situation, there's no way for white to win, and it's very likely that black is going to be able to checkmate white eventually against, you know, a rook and with a lone king. So black really, it was sort of a bad guess that white would just go ahead and trade off his bishop, especially since that bishop is now pinning black's knight to his king. So yeah, that's an example of a fork with the king. You remember the king can only move one square in any direction, and since you can't move into check, you're not going to be able to fork certain pieces with the king. For example, a bishop or a queen, and the way you fork certain pieces, like a rook, you're gonna have to do it on a diagonal because you can't move onto being under attack from the rook. So the way you fork pieces with the king is a little bit different, simply because, like I said, you can't move into check. So and with a pawn, the pawns can attack on diagonals. So if you want to fork a pawn in a knight, for example, you would have to get your king to e4 in this situation, or behind the pawn, because he only attacks diagonals going forward. So this will be a fork on those pieces, and that maybe wouldn't be a great move to do, but if you had like a bishop sitting here protecting that square or whatnot. But anyway, that is something you need to be aware of with king forks. And king forks really aren't going to be coming up until maybe the late game, where you're down to just a handful of pieces, and your king sort of becomes an attacking piece. But again, you have to be careful of checkmate. You have to be careful of counterattacks and all sorts of stuff when you bring your king into the equation. So it's going to take, depending on the situation, if black's got a whole bunch of other pieces, you really have to be sort of careful getting your king out there in the middle of the board, because the more pieces, generally the easier it is for the other player to counterattack. The more pieces they have, and so you really don't want to be risking your king against maybe a board that looks something like this. Even if you say, oh well, that's it's sort of a fork. Let's just say it's even like this. It's like, yeah, sure, you're threatening these pieces, but I mean, your king is incredibly exposed here. So you really have to be careful about this sort of a position, and having your king out in the middle of the board like this, generally very dangerous. So yeah, that's pretty much all the examples I'm going to go through with the fork. Yeah, so sort of the takeaways here: forking a king and another piece is generally really strong. If you can fork like a queen and a rook, that's also a lot of times going to be pretty strong. If you fork pieces that are both undefended, again, that's generally really strong. But you need to be aware that just because you get what looks like a good fork doesn't mean that your opponent might not have a fork of his own, a counterattack of his own. If you fork something and it's going to it's going to take you 2 moves to capture something, well, you still need to watch out for checkmate, because even if you get like their queen or something like that with a fork, if it lets them set up a checkmate, then you're going to have to winning that queen isn't going to do anything, because you're going to lose the game to checkmate. So just because you see a fork and you start to do it, you still have to continue looking at what the opponent can do with his pieces. Now if your fork is on his king and his queen, that's a little different, as they have to deal with the check before they do any sort of other counterattacking and stuff. So yeah, but if it's a fork on like a queen and a rook or what have you, and you think, okay, they're going to have to move their queen or their rook, that's not necessarily true, and it's not always the best move for them to even try to protect those pieces. The goal of the game is checkmate at the end of the day. So I mean, according to the rules, that's how you win games of chess. So that's really what you're looking for when you're playing, and what you want to defend against as well. Not just looking for getting your own checkmates and attacks, but looking out for your own king's sort of protection or safety. And I will go through a lot of the different checkmates and a lot of the common sort of ways of attacking and defending the king in later videos. But this is going to be the end of this video, and hopefully you got a lot of information out of it. And again, knowing the tactics sort of inside and out is really one step towards getting better at this game, because these tactics are going to come up, a lot throughout a game of chess generally, and being aware of them before they happen to you, or being aware of the chances for you to attack, in different ways, it really helps you both towards getting advantages and avoiding really big blunders in the game of chess. Sort of being aware of all the different sort of board situations that allow you to get to get forks, to get checkmate, to get all these things. It really helps you look at your moves in a more focused and sort of logical way. Whereas if you aren't really aware of the different ways of getting forks, maybe you know about certain forks, but you don't, you haven't seen a lot of like knight forks or bishop forks, or rook and queen forks, or pawn forks, for example. You might be less likely to both to use those, and you might be more likely to sort of be a victim of that, and fall into making blunders, which can sort of quickly lead to you losing the game, or getting in a really bad position. But once you start to see these tactics in action, you start to use them. You see ways of countering them. If you get forked, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes you're going to have moves that let you get out of that fork without being in too bad of a position. Sometimes you won't, and they can be game deciding, but you will know going forward, to be aware of that, and you will be that much closer to being a pretty solid chess player. And again, a big part of it is really how much you consider your different options, your moves, and your opponent's moves, and how quickly you can do that. Because the more experience you get, the quicker you can make your moves. Not that you always want to move as fast as you can, but the quicker you can sort of identify the good moves and the bad moves, it's going to help you, sort of look multiple moves down the road, and predict things a little bit better. What your opponent might do, what they probably are going to do, and predict moves that you can do to get yourself in good attacking situations, and everything else. So hopefully you found this video informative, and again, stay tuned for future videos where we'll go through the other tactics and other aspects of the game, and try to help you improve your game.